Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our podcast, Globalization Girls, with
Anna,
Tyra,
and Chloe. And we are all seniors at the University of San Diego. So we have this podcast because it allows us to have a space where we can discuss topics in ethnic studies. Shout out Dr. Diaz. But today we're going to be discussing the historical and contemporary global practice of sterilization of women in order to subdue and control population of impoverished and marginalized individuals for the benefit of capitalism and neoliberalism. Today's discussion is motivated by the persistent systemic oppression and disregard for human rights, which are commonly observed under capitalist economies and neoliberal ideologies. So I'm going to hand it off to Anna to talk about a little background.
Yeah, so we're talking about female sterilization. Female sterilization is an irreversible procedure which permanently prevents pregnancy. It's a legitimate form of birth control for some, but erasure for others. So forced female sterilization is a form of eugenics that's been in practice throughout the world. Historically, some countries have mandated the sterilization of undesirable populations, such as indigenous groups and those living in poverty. For indigenous populations, this is equivalent to cultural genocide. For other groups, sterilization has not been mandatory, but only in the loosest sense. Women with membership in these aforementioned undesirable groups have limited or no access to education regarding their sexual health, and pressures to be able to support a family and pressures from employers have created an impossible environment in which the women who are coerced into undergoing the procedure have very little choice. For many, institutional control over women's reproductive rights is viewed as their only feasible option for birth control. Through coercive policy and cultures, national governments and institutions have enacted policies of forced or pressured female sterilization in order to control population and the welfare of the state. Rather than continuing to expend the necessary resources to support these groups and hurt their economies, governments would prefer to limit the amount of welfare that they must provide to these groups.
So I'm going to paint an image of how often this occurs worldwide. I think these figures will surprise our listeners, being that has surprised us and provided a lot of information about what's going on worldwide in regards to women and sterilization. Many people are under the impression that eugenics is a thing of the past, but in our research, we found some startling numbers that we will readily make available.
Yeah, so our first focus is going to be on the sterilization of indigenous cultures. So we found these to be a majority of the examples in our investigation. So we came across a really great text by Andrea Smith called Conquest, and in a chapter called Better Dead Than Pregnant, the colonization of Native women's reproductive health, we found that she argued that colonization of Native women's reproductive health has aimed to slow the growth of Native populations because it threatened the well-being of capitalism in the United States. So as a result, various forms of oppressive legislature and women's reproductive education have made it difficult for Native women and women of color to have access to knowledge regarding their reproductive health, and then they often fall victim to practices of sterilization and then also very dangerous contraceptions, abortions, and lack of access to women's rights movements. So Native women in the United States were seen as inherently dirty, and it became necessary for the United States government to cleanse and purify this population at any cost to control the populations of Native people that were seen as a detriment to society. So sterilization practices began and often happened without proper education or consent of women, which led to decreasing populations and the erasure of these communities. Through our research, we found that across the country, an estimated 25% of Native women of childbearing age were sterilized by 1976.
I'm going to talk a little bit about Australia's history with eugenics. They have issues both with Indigenous populations and non-Indigenous populations. We'll talk about the Indigenous populations now. So Australia's eugenics in the past chiefly targeted Aboriginal people through child removal practices and other controlled the ethnicity of future populations through the immigration policy that was informally known as the White Australia policy, which was a form of cultural eugenics. They were trying to unify into one superior white race. Yeah. And something that we found is that in 2003, a Pine Creek man named Lance Lawrence called for a full investigation into claims from that Aboriginal women in the Arnhem Land are being sterilized without their consent. He was approached by a woman who was sterilized in the 1970s. She had stated that large numbers of people she knows were also sterilized without consent. The lack of the English-speaking members in her Aboriginal community and their further lack of understanding of the procedure made it such that they had no real way of bringing this issue to anyone's attention and couldn't really get anything done about it, didn't have any voice or anyone to fight for them.
Just like this is happening in Australia, it's also happening in Peru, Canada, and China. Just before the turn of the 21st century, the government of the Peruvian president Alberto Fujimori approved use of sexual sterilization to curtail Peru's indigenous population, and this resulted in approximately 300,000 sterilizations. In Canada, in the late 2015 and early 2016, Canada's national network, the Canadian Broadcasting Commission, issued several reports detailing cases in which First Nations women had recently been sterilized without or with dubious consent in Alberta's neighboring province of Saskatchewan. And for China, since 2017, more than 1 million Muslim minorities, including a predominantly Turkic-speaking ethnic minority in Xinjiang, have been taken to detention camps in China without any proper trials. Uyghur women testified to the horrors they have endured, including new reports of forced sterilization. One Uyghur woman interviewed by French television said she was constantly injected with a substance during her detention that stopped her periods. So as you can see, throughout all of these places, China, Canada, Peru, and Australia, women and men are being taken advantage of, and they are being sterilized with or without their permission, and sometimes they're not even aware of what's occurring to them.
Exactly, and so I think that this kind of highlights how this eugenics movement has been globalized from the U.S. outward, and using sterilization as a tool of eugenics in order to suppress certain groups of people and try to erase them. And I think this really reminds me of the LOSA reading on the Broqueros that we covered in our class, because the Broquero program was a program that was implemented in the mid-1900s by the U.S. government. And the U.S. made an agreement with the Mexican government to draw in Mexican laborers to fulfill agricultural needs and some other industrial worker positions. And the reason why that Mexico did agree to this was because they saw this as an opportunity to erase indigenous people. So the Broquero program became this giant opportunity for the indigenous and certain lower classes of Mexican citizens to be socialized into modernity, an effort to push Mexico toward technologically advanced fields of agriculture and industry. And through this, indigenous people were essentially bred out, their lands were stripped away from them, and it worked to really disband their communities. It also, the discrimination and isolation forced indigenous people into racialized nation-building modernization projects and created a false notion that Mexican modernity had a place for indigenous people in the future, when in reality they were really just trying to rid this community entirely. And so this deeply connects to sterilization, because this practice of sterilization was used in Mexico, but also other programs popped up in order to erase this community and to also, benefit capitalism by not having to support these people anymore, and rid those social programs and just push them into a way of, labor and silence.
I think one of the really big issues here is something that's really observed through neoliberalism in practice. This program is supposed to give these groups of people the opportunity for some social mobilization. They under a neoliberal theory, they are responsible for their well-being after this, so this is a way for the Mexican government to pawn them off, like Chloe said. But their shortcomings, any inability to provide for themselves, is blamed on them under this ideology. And that's really problematic because in practice of neoliberalism, the asymmetries of power that develop are so strong that they had very little control. If they had these horrible working conditions and brutal work and people were dying and people were mistreated, and they were doing everything they were supposed to do. They were working neoliberalism. A neoliberal system was supposed to benefit them, but they were such an expendable group under this system that they had no voice, and this asymmetry of power was essentially designed to kill them, to erase their sort of history.
Definitely, yeah. I think it deeply connects to neoliberalism and capitalism, and how, governments will go very far in order to rid these people from the community so that they can, take land or not have to deal with them, abuse these communities. It comes down to resources, improve over water, basic necessities. And so I think this is a problem that is continued today, and countries that we have just spoken of implement this eugenic kind of practice in order to benefit their economic systems and basically remove any sort of support structures that need to be there for these communities.
Yeah, it's very interesting, I think, because they really present this in a way, they really are operating under the guise of this is going to help you, your participation in this program, your voluntary sterilization will benefit you and help you live in better conditions. But due to the existing structures, social structures that they live in, and institutional oppression that they're already under, they're cut off from even more resources. There's no way out. Their sort of identities are erased in there, or in the case of the women who are being sterilized, their reproductive rights are being taken away. It's being regulated by the government, which is a really sort of problematic thing, because I think that's such a big component of women's identity particularly, and there's no place for that in this system.
Definitely, and I think that because this is happening so much with lack of information, these women are trusting the government that they're doing something that is going to support them and that is safe, and what actually ends up happening is that these women are being stripped of any potential, chance of having a child in the future. Oftentimes they're misled to believe it's a temporary procedure, and then they want to have a kid later on in their life if it's done to them at a very, very young age, or they've already had a couple of kids and they just want to wait till they have their next child, and then they realize wow, there's nothing I can do now. I've been stripped of the ability to have a child. And then on top of that, it's also done in a very dangerous way a lot of times. It's not done with proper equipment, it's not sterile, so all of these things are really dangerous to their communities and work to erase them as a people. If you take away a woman's right to have children, how is this community going to continue to grow in the future if you're diminishing their potential of having even a population growth moving forward?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I think we'll be moving into our next topic on non-Indigenous people. So as we continue on with our discussion, I think it's important to highlight that not only are Indigenous women impacted by this practice of sterilization to support eugenics, but other marginalized and minority women internationally are impacted by this globalized practice of oppressing communities and erasure, essentially.
Now let's move on to talking about the forced sterilization of non-Indigenous cultures. Other women throughout the world, and particularly marginalized women of color, are subjected to this global practice. For instance, in the United States, California in specific, and in their prison system, 150 Latina and African American women were sterilized between 2006 and 2010. For India, another example, during the 1975 emergency, when civil liberties were suspended, Sanjay Gandhi began what was described by many as the gruesome campaign to sterilize poor men. There are reports of police cordoning off villages and virtually dragging the men to surgery. An astonishing 6.2 million Indian men were sterilized in just a year, which was 50 times the number of people sterilized by the Nazis. This is according to science journalist Mara. 2,000 men also died from botched operations. So as you can see, family planning efforts began in the 1970s. India has focused its population control efforts on women, even though, as scientists say, sterilizations are easier to perform in men, and this may be because women are deemed less likely to protest. According to UN statistics from 2006, 37% of women in India have undergone sexual sterilization. India carried out nearly 4 million sterilizations during 2013 to 2014, according to official figures. Less than 100,000 of these surgeries were done on men. More than 700 deaths were reported due to botched surgeries between 2009 and 2012. There were 356 reported cases of complications arising out of these surgeries, and at the end of 2014, at least a dozen women in the central India state died after undergoing sexual sterilization as part of a paid incentive program aimed to control poverty through population containment.
I'm going to talk a little bit about Puerto Rico. The history of coercive population control policy in Puerto Rico began with a superintendent of the U.S. Eugenics Record Office named Harry Laughlin. Laughlin used a model eugenical sterilization law to implement the mandatory sterilization of what he deemed the socially inadequate in 30 U.S. states and Puerto Rico. So this overtly eugenic policy deliberately targeted groups of people for sterilization, such as the feeble-minded, the insane, orphans, what an article described as ne'er-do-wells. And these policies actually later inspired Hitler's forced sterilization program in Europe. So I think, when a lot of people think about eugenics, you think about the Holocaust and you think about Hitler, but it's actually something that's been going on for so much longer before and remains after.
Definitely, I think that really relates to, like the U.S. pushing out their ideologies and how it's spread globally.
And so in Puerto Rico, overpopulation was viewed as a problem to the welfare of the state. So progressive eugenists argued that forced sterilization would actually improve the lives of the impoverished population. And for local women, the lack of legal abortion services and the stigma associated with getting an abortion limited their reproductive choices. And as a result, many women came to accept sterilization, which was legal and far more socially accepted. So by the 1970s, U.S. feminists and Puerto Rican anti-colonialists united to end the practice of forced sterilization. But there still exists this legacy of distrust of kind of the U.S. government intervention in Puerto Rican society. It is still remained very prevalent that while the sterilization was not mandatory in the cases, it was essentially mandatory for these women because there exists a gendered framework that led to the widespread disabuse of Puerto Rican women's reproductive rights. The women live in a culture where their fertility is seen as a detriment to their productive capacity and well-being. And so sterilization was kind of the solution to kind of fix this flawed aspect of their femininity.
Definitely, and I think that really relates to Australia. Because it was reported in 2012 that the Senate of Australia launched an inquiry into contemporary, often non-consensual sterilization of girls and women with disabilities. And unlike Canada and the U.S., Australia never passed a eugenic sterilization law, but it does not have any laws in place to prohibit the forced sterilization of women with disabilities or of children, and therefore it does fall under the UN definition of torture. And so I think that again, this is highlighting, globalization of sterilization. Eugenics has been something that has spread internationally, has been used to, be a reason why it's somehow okay to sterilize people and take away the rights over their autonomy and their bodies.
Yeah, so to bring this back to class, our ethics class, we've been reading articles throughout the year. And with that being said, we have pulled out 2 authors that we think connect to the topic of sterilization and the oppression of the lower class, and how countries exploit their people in order to see profits, or in order to, like we've said, erase a generation and ethnicity. So with that being said, the neoliberalism is a system that benefits the upper class and is created to keep the lower class at a disadvantage. We watched a film called Maquilapolis, as well as read the article from Harvey that illustrates the exploitation that the women who work in the maquiladoras experience. It presents the effect neoliberalism has had on developing countries and how it affects the people, the environment, and the politics of that developing country. The women that were deemed to be the optimal choice of labor for the maquiladoras were paid unlivable wages. The homes and communities are contaminated with lead, paint, chemicals, and many other dangerous items that are utilized within the factories but are not disposed of correctly. The women endure these circumstances and sacrifice themselves for the well-being of their children and family. And the generations to follow are being affected already, in which the new births are coming out with physical disabilities. There were examples where a child was born with a major brain defect, some were born without a brain, other babies are coming out with breathing issues, etc. So the generations to come are going to suffer the effects of globalization in Tijuana, just like we saw this within the examples that we gave previously, how they have been trying to erase generations of people and ethnicities. This is going on all around the world, and Harvey made a great illustration of the women that are suffering this in Tijuana.
I think that the situation with these women is really, really applicable because, like we were talking about the asymmetries of power in neoliberalism, there's also the asymmetry of information. And so with these women working in the maquiladoras, they did not often, they could not speak or read English. And so there were these warning labels on the supplies that they used, and those things did cause these birth defects like you're talking about, and also death, but infertility. So I think this is kind of a way that they were sterilized, not perhaps so intentionally, but the effects were known, just not by them, and they didn't really have a choice in that. And their productive capacity, they were so overworked, and they didn't really have the ability. All they were trying to do is make money, be able to care for their families, but kind of having children and having these expenses, and what they were working for is to support these children. So having children was really seen, or could be perceived as, a detriment to the well-being of your family if you had too many children or anything like that. And so you could see how when having children and viewing your fertility in a negative light, you could see how women would opt for these sterilization procedures, because it is nearly impossible for them to survive in a system that is supposed to allow them to survive. And that's really the unfairness of neoliberalism to these disadvantaged groups.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the U.S. was definitely misleading when it came to sterilization. They were pretending like this was a practice that, was supporting women of color in these communities, and, birth control that could help them to cut, costs and make their quality of life better. But in reality, they were stripping them of the rights over their bodies and their ability to have children in the future. And also try to avoid any sort of consequences that came from their terrible working conditions.
Yeah, like these girls have mentioned, these people are stuck within a perpetual cycle that they themselves don't know how to get out of. It starts from their lack of education, as well as their poverty, and then the fact that they're getting exploited and put into worse conditions. So these people don't really know how to get out of the circumstance that they're in. And with the dreams that the United States is selling them of getting them to the factories or getting them to work in the Bracero program, as we have mentioned, these women need to find a way to speak up and have their voices heard, and we are seeing that occurring as of recently in Latin America countries. But like I mentioned, hopefully we will see this happening more across the world.
Definitely, and I think that really relates to the Gruwell reading as well, because the author highlighted that neoliberalism is found in our global civil society, and that these wildly divergent transnational connectivities create economic disparity and other detrimental impacts that are now starting to be globally questioned and addressed in order to work to redress their effects. So I think that's a really important point that the author makes about neoliberalism and how, women's rights movements are really essential in combating these problems.
I think that a large issue in viewing the forced sterilization of women is kind of in the development of their rights as national economies had transitioned to global economies. I think women have long been a group excluded by the inherent rights of humans, which capitalist and neoliberal ideologies are meant to guarantee. In patriarchal systems, the identity of a woman is made complex by her reproductive rights. Motherhood doesn't fit into the mold of an ideal self-sustaining individual in a capitalist economy. And in her text, Women's Rights as Human Rights, that Chloe referenced, Gruwell claims that women's issues are not separate but are neglected aspects of global agendas. So the issues arise in the inability of patriarchal states to address the problems of violence against women. Forced sterilization is a form of violence against women, and I think it's really interesting to see that in the majority of what we're seeing, women are the ones being forcefully sterilized, when female sterilization is far more dangerous and irreversible than male sterilization. One of our sources talking about India stated that women were being sterilized because they were less likely to protest, which I think is very exemplary of the erasure of women's roles and voices throughout history, that has put them in this place where it seems like there's no choice.
Definitely, and I think that's why it's really important that we're seeing women fighting back against this eugenic and patriarchal society that has worked to oppress them and strip them of rights over their bodies and over their voices as well. And so we're seeing a lot of awareness being brought to these issues, and women of color and marginalized women pushing to be part of the feminist movement that was once just for white women, because they're these are problems that are impacting us, immensely, and they need to be addressed on a global scale.
Yeah.
I think that globalism has definitely allowed for these connections to be formed and created more of, I think that there's a long way to go, but more of an intersectional feminism.
Yeah, so as Chloe has mentioned, women are always a target, or most often a target from these governments, being that they are believed to not speak up. For instance, in Tijuana, these women are mostly the labor workers of these factories, and although it is seen because they have a more body size that it will help them during the factory, it's also because they are believed to be submissive, easier to be silenced, and more allowing for them to be utilized as a commodity rather than the human beings that they are. So again, this is only believed to be. Women have been speaking up in Tijuana and building their own unions and being their own, supporters when the government themselves aren't supporting these women. So these women around the world, as well as in Tijuana, are fighting against these patriarchal structures and for their own rights and the rights of their family, as well as the generations to come.
Definitely. And I think it's also ties really into our discussion in class on Chile's movement. Women had a flash mob protest on International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women, where they had a song and dance that really highlighted violence against women, rape, the issues with the patriarchy and the government, and they were trying to really draw attention to the fact that the failure of the justice system and how, a lot of these rapes and abuses were not being recognized, they weren't being treated properly. The government was working to silence them and stripping them of rights over their bodies. And so although globalization has spread, the practice of sterilization and the theory of eugenics, it also has created the opportunity in this case to allow women to connect internationally on these kinds of issues and spread awareness. So that, this flash mob was brought to several other countries internationally throughout, South and Central America. There was in Mexico, is in Europe. There's some in the United States. So really bringing light to these issues, and women, finding solidarity amongst each other is really important in these instances. Well, thank you everyone for tuning in today for this week's podcast on female sterilization, and we hope that you guys enjoyed it. Hopefully everyone gained some new insights, because I think that we all have here throughout our research and this wonderful conversation that we have had. But remember to check out our Instagram at Sterilization Worldwide to learn more about globalization and sterilization, and tune in next week for further podcasts.